In the late 1890s, the 45 United States formed a rich and gigantic adolescent among nations. The country boomed industrially. It had not needed to take part in colonial expansion before, because it had its own western vastnesses to settle. It was only now realizing that the western frontier was not limitless. To expand further, the United States would have to look overseas. Across the ocean, Spain, weary and bankrupt, had only antique memories of Spain's Siglo de Oro, the golden century of conquest after Columbus's discoveries, to dimly fire the national pride. Now only the Caribbean islands of Cuba, the world's sugar bowl, and Puerto Rico remained as Spanish jewels across the Atlantic, and Cuba had warred long for its freedom. Cuban insurgent exiles in New York had formed juntas, clubs crafted to supply money, supplies, and arms to the rebels. The juntas released to the circulation-hungry New York press, led by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, an endless stream of atrocity stories, some fanciful, some all too real. The first rebel flag flew not over Cuba, but over the New York sun. President Grover Cleveland labored to keep America neutral, imposing a blockade on Cuban-bound insurgents, although the harsh Spanish suppression was undermining that neutrality. In 1894, the United States imposed a brutal tariff on Spanish sugar, an economic move that would add to political tensions. Quickly, the economy of Cuba crumbled, and with it the patience of the people, with heavy-handed Spanish domination. Spain sent more men and more repression. In 1896, the triumph of William McKinley over idealistic William Jennings Bryan for the U.S. presidency dashed the best hope of the Cuban insurrectos for immediate U.S. support of their cause, but they were patient. The president-elect, a Civil War veteran and war hater, heard the distant drums of war being beaten in calls for U.S. intervention. He looked ahead reluctantly to the state of the American military forces he would inherit. The Army's readiness in 1898 was nothing to make even a fifth-rate European power tremble. It presented no unit larger than a regiment. Even those regiments had never been trained to work together in large-scale combat. Still, they were tough, well-trained veterans of plains combat and even the Civil War, and made an excellent cadre to train a large, quickly raised force. They would do themselves proud, but there would be many stumbles against a powerful, more numerous and experienced enemy. The story was much better for the Navy. The obsolete coastal defense force of monitors and wooden ships had mostly vanished before a mighty new naval doctrine. The United States Navy now owned some fast, heavily gunned armored ships that could more than hold their own with European warships. With a young and tigerish Theodore Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the fleet had a steamroller advocate. It figured high in U.S. war plans.
Everything starts with the Maine, U.S. battleship that is sent into Havana Harbor January 25th, 1898. There has been a revolt. We are afraid that American citizens and American interests are going to be affected, and it's essentially showing the flag.
At 9:45 on the evening of February 15, 1898, the USS Maine was buttoned up. Much of the 374-man crew not on watch were in their bunks and hammocks. The enlisted men's quarters were forward, above the ship's coal bunkers and powder magazines. The officers quartered further aft. With two deafening, flaming, reverberating explosions, the Maine blew to pieces. More than two-thirds of the crew were killed or mortally injured, 268 men. The ship settled to the bottom, the harbor's shallowness saving the remaining crew from drowning. Captain Sigsbee sent a remarkably restrained message to Washington.
And he tells the Secretary of the Navy, don't let anybody speculate on this. We don't know what caused it.
But across America, the bugles of war began to sound before some important doubts could be examined.
But by the next edition of one of Hearst's papers, here's the headline: the Maine has been blown up, and there's suspicion of a mine, and they are accusing the Spaniards of blowing up the Maine. And that becomes the immediate public perception of what happened to the Maine.
Senator Henry Teller pushed through a joint resolution disclaiming intentions of annexing Cuba, but part of the resolution was a demand that Spain leave Cuba. On April 19th, Congress recognized the independence of Cuba. Spain broke off relations the next day. On the 21st, a naval blockade of Cuba began, an insult to sovereignty that brought a Spanish declaration of war on the 23rd. On the 25th of April, the United States declared war itself. Recruiting offices overflowed with volunteers eager to right the Cuban wrongs. And the Spanish-American War charged toward an uproarious opening that had been in planning for many months. Everything McKinley had feared most had happened. By 10 o'clock on the night of April 30th, the flagship Olympia was first through Manila Bay's southern and wider channel, with the Baltimore following and the rest of the fleet slipping through in line. A lookout spotted what he would call the awe-inspiring form of the Spanish fleet. "You may fire when ready, Gridley," said Commodore Dewey to the Olympia's captain as he prepared to enter the history books. At 5,500 yards, she, the Baltimore, and the Boston sent 250-pound shells hurtling toward the fast-firing Castilla and the Reina Cristina. The Battle of Manila Bay had begun, and America would never be the same. The outgunned, outmaneuvered Spanish fleet battling in Manila Bay began to disintegrate under the fusillade.
Increase 2,100 yards! Second best! Fire!
The crushing fire now rained down on the Spanish admiral's flagship, the Isla de Cuba, and the brilliant white sides of the Castilla. Dark columns of smoke and deadly fires appeared aboard them. The Duero did no better, and the Ulloa tried to dodge away from the barrage. Only 5 days after the war resolution, America had a glorious, unexpected victory over what they called the Spanish Dons, at a place they scarcely knew existed, and a hero of heroes in George Dewey. There was still the far greater matter of Cuba and much more dangerous units of the Spanish fleet in the Atlantic, but victory-mad America was not worrying, not yet. Theodore Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, ordered a natty Brooks Brothers uniform, and got involved in raising a colorful polyglot regiment of volunteer cavalry known as the Rough Riders. The level-headed Teddy recognized his inexperience in arms and deferred to his old regular Army friend, Colonel Leonard Wood, in the leadership of the regiment. The swamps and jungles of Cuba were a great influence on American strategy. These were hotbeds of disease. With no organization to coordinate the War and Navy departments, chaos threatened to take hold, especially in the largely amateur militia and volunteer forces. The handful of U.S. regulars had only their Indian fighting experience to put against a much larger Spanish army, blooded in years of big colonial wars. Since the declaration of war, the U.S. blockade of Cuba had been led by the squadron commanded by Admiral William T. Sampson. The blockade of Cuba was an aggressive one. Coastal batteries were engaged deliberately. Men were lost in the bombardment of San Juan, Puerto Rico. Roosevelt, now leading the Rough Riders after Wood's promotion to brigadier, heard the orders, "The heights must be taken at all hazards." When a regular Army unit in front of him hesitated, Roosevelt snapped, "Then let my men through, sir."
On your feet! Move on!
The Rough Riders pressed upward, joined by the Black 1st and 10th, the 71st New York, and other units. Roosevelt and his men conducted two separate gallant charges, one against Kettle Hill and another against San Juan Hill. Then came a pivotal moment in the fight. The troops looked around for the source of what they called a peculiar drumming sound.
What made the American attack actually successful was Lieutenant John Parker showed up with his 4 Gatling guns and started peppering the Spanish lines. The Spanish were on the geographical crest of the hill, and they were outlined, they were skylined, relatively easy targets. Parker used his Gatling guns like they were artillery.
As the color bearer of the White 3rd Cavalry went down, the bearer of the Black 10th took up its colors with his own, carrying both as the troops swept forward. The soldiers began cheering. The black units, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th Infantry at San Juan, stirred all who saw them fight. Roosevelt wrote of their being completely intermingled, white regulars, colored regulars, and Rough Riders. Then suddenly the Spanish were gone. The Battle of San Juan Hill ended. With the Spanish fleet gone, Santiago lost its strategic value. To avoid a bloody fight for Santiago, and for Havana with its 25,000 troops, Secretary of War Alger proposed a clever ploy. If the Spanish surrendered, he would immediately return their troops to Spain at United States expense. It would save Spanish honor and undermine the morale of any troops remaining behind. Spain's Cuban commander, General José Toral Vasquez, negotiated further with Shafter, well aware that the United States was pouring in fresh torrents of troops and weapons. At last, permission was given in Spain for the surrender of Santiago to Shafter under the repatriation plan. The Spanish surrendered not just the garrison, but 9,000 troops now cut off outside the city. Yellow fever and malaria took hold with a vengeance. By the end of July, 4,000 soldiers were down.
Roosevelt and the other officers realized the fever was going to decimate the troops if they didn't get out of there very quickly before the rainy season came.
Unlike Cuba, whose annexation had been disclaimed by the Teller Resolution, Puerto Rico was targeted for seizure by the United States. Its fine anchorage at San Juan would ensure United States naval control of the Caribbean.
Hawaii, during the 1890s, had been the scene of a rebellion against the native monarchy by local white American settlers. During the war, President McKinley pushed through Congress a treaty annexing Hawaii as formally a territory of the United States. The formal peace conference took place at Paris during the autumn of 1898. Spain would evacuate Cuba, and her troops would be replaced by those of the United States until we established a Cuban republic. It was during this peace conference that the Americans decided to annex the Philippines, as well as Puerto Rico.
The United States would pay Spain $20 million and also get the Philippines and Guam in the Marianas. Just as San Juan Hill would vault Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, the Spanish-American War would hurl the country out among the old powers with an aggressive new thrust of growing military and economic might. Sometimes the strength would not be used attractively over the new century, and at other times it would save an oppression-racked world when nothing else could. Many have disagreed, but most Americans adored what would be the only war that seemed to mass-produce heroes and glory, cost little, and gain much. John Hay, ambassador to Great Britain, would later write to Theodore Roosevelt, "It has been a splendid little war, begun with the highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, and favored by the fortune that loves the brave." But the American Rough Riders would never completely go home after America's splendid little war.